The bunker smelled like cold concrete in old secrets. It was the kind of smell that seeps into stone over years and stays long after the people who built the place are gone. The emergency lighting along the floor cast thin orange lines across the walls, just enough to see by, not enough to feel safe. The air sat heavy and still, the way air does when it has not moved in a long time, when the world above has forgotten that something exists beneath it. The six men came down the stairs fast. They were professionals, every one of them. The kind of men who had trained for thousands of hours to breach a room exactly like this one narrow approach, single entry, point, unknown threat level. They came in tight formation, weapons up, NVGs, flip boots silent on the concrete steps. Captain Miles Hargrove led the point. Behind him, Sergeant First Class Derek Briggs. Behind Briggs, the team's attached medic Nathan Reeve. Three more stacked behind them. They were halfway down the stairs when Nathan Reeve stopped. He stopped so abruptly that the man behind him walked into his back. Not because the room presented a tactical threat he had not anticipated, because the orange light from the floor fell across the face of the woman sitting in the center of the room, and in that light, Nathan Reeve saw something that made his body make a decision before his mind had finished processing what his eyes were transmitting. He had seen that face before. Not here, not in any operational environment he had been officially deployed to. In a photograph, in a target confirmation file, in a folder stamped with a classification level he had not been cleared for, and that had been shown to him anyway briefly by a man in civilian clothes in a hotel room in Bucharest in September of 2021, who had pointed to the face in the photograph and said, "Confirm this is the individual who will be in the vehicle on Route 7 tomorrow morning." Reeve had confirmed it. He had believed he was confirming a surveillance target. He had not asked what the confirmation was for because the man in civilian clothes had been very good at making it seem like asking questions was both unnecessary and mildly insulting to everyone involved. He stood on the bunker stairs and he did not move. Hargrove cleared the bottom of the staircase and stopped. The rest of the team spread into the room and stopped. The stopping was not simultaneous, but it arrived at the same destination as each man processed what was in front of him. The room was 30 feet across, bare walls, a support beam near the eastern corner. In the far wall, a second door sealed and rusted shut, and in the center of the room, sitting on the cold concrete floor with her back straight and her legs extended, was a young woman who looked like she had been waiting for them for the better part of an hour. She was small, 5'4" at the most, 120 pounds, dark hair pulled back tight. She wore tactical pants and a faded gray thermal that had seen better years. Her left leg ended just below the knee, and the carbon fiber prosthetic that should have been attached to it was lying on the floor beside her, detached and still, like something she had set aside because she no longer needed it for the moment. On her lap sat a Remington 700 bolt-action rifle, her right hand resting loosely near the grip. Not clutching it, just resting there the way a person rests a hand on something they have touched 10,000 times before. In front of her, between her and the six men with weapons pointed at her chest, sat a titanium hardcase. Scratched, dented along one corner, sealed with a lock that required both a 12-digit code and a biometric confirmation to open. She looked at them, not the way a cornered person looks at armed men. The way a chess player looks at a board when the game has already been decided and the other side simply has not realized it yet. She said without looking at any of them specifically, because she did not need to, 49 minutes from the perimeter. I estimated 45. A pause. I will adjust my model. Nobody moved. Hargrove lowered his weapon by 2 degrees. He looked at the woman. He looked at the case. He looked at the woman again. Hands, he said. She raised her left hand, palm out, fingers spread. Her right hand did not move from the Remington. I can show you both, she said, but it will not be pleasant for anyone in this room. Briggs, who had never in his career stood at the bottom of a staircase and felt genuinely uncertain what to say next, stood at the bottom of this staircase and felt genuinely uncertain what to say next. Hargrove glanced back at his formation. His eyes moved past Webb, past the junior operators, and stopped on Nathan Reeve, still standing on the third step, both feet planted, weight wrong, staring at the woman on the floor with an expression that had nothing to do with tactical assessment. Hargrove had spent 20 years reading his people's faces. What was on Reeve's face was not surprise at the situation. It was something older, something that had arrived with him from somewhere else entirely. Hargrove filed it away. He turned back to the room. This is the story of Sloane Carter. And before you can understand what she was doing in that bunker alone with a rifle on her lap and a case full of the kind of truth that powerful men spend careers burying, you need to understand where she came from. You need to understand her father. You need to understand what he carried home from the desert in 1991 and what it cost him over the following 2 decades and what it cost her and why she made a promise to her mother at age 14 that she kept for 12 years until the world gave her no choice but to break it. Because nothing about that night in the bunker was accidental. Every piece of it had been planned, every position calculated, every variable accounted for, including the 49 minutes it took 6 trained operators to reach her from the moment she triggered the perimeter sensors herself deliberately, because she needed witnesses in that room before the upload completed and before the CIA element arrived, and the only way to get witnesses on the right timeline was to invite them herself. But we will get to that. First, Tennessee, first a man named Glenn Carter. First, a backyard on a Saturday morning in the summer of 2010, and a 12-year-old girl learning that the world is not always what it appears to be, and that the people you love sometimes carry burdens they cannot put down, and that the most important thing a father can give his daughter is not safety, but preparation. Glenn Carter had been a big man once. You could still see it in the frame. The wide shoulders, the hands that looked like they could bend, rebar the posture that never fully relaxed even in his own backyard. But the desert had taken something from him that years of civilian life could not restore. His lungs primarily. He had come back from the Gulf with a cough that started small and grew slowly, the kind of persistent damage that the medical establishment in the 90s did not fully understand, and the government was slow to acknowledge. They called it Gulf War illness eventually, a term that covered a range of conditions affecting somewhere around 250,000 veterans who had served in that theater. Respiratory damage, chronic pain, cancers that appeared years later without warning. Glenn Carter's version lived in his lungs and took its time with him, which was almost worse than something fast because slow gave him time to think about what he needed to do before the end of it. He knew what was coming. Not the exact timeline, but the direction. And so in the summer of 2010, when Sloan was 12 years old and still young enough to believe her father was invincible, and old enough to sense that something was wrong, he took her out to the back of their property on a Saturday morning with a Remington 700 he had owned for longer than she had been alive, and he began to teach her. He did not explain why that first day. He just showed her how to hold it, how to breathe, how to find stillness in the center of your body even when your heart is working against you. He was a patient teacher, which surprised her because Glenn Carter was not a patient man in most areas of life. But with this, he took his time. He corrected her grip without frustration. He talked her through the physics of it, the bullet drop at distance, the wind drift, the way every variable compounds, and how you account for what you cannot see by accounting for what you can. She was a natural. That did not entirely surprise him. They went out on Saturday mornings for 2 years, through the end of middle school and into high school, through seasons and weather and the gradual thickening of the cough that Glenn tried to conceal behind closed doors and that Sloan could hear through the thin walls of their house at certain hours of the night. On the mornings he was well enough, they went out back. On the mornings he was not, they sat at the kitchen table and he talked to her about the other things, about reading terrain, about patience as a skill rather than a personality trait, about the difference between reacting and deciding, and why the space between those two things is where most outcomes are actually determined. He never talked about the war directly, not the specifics. He would reference Kuwait in passing, mention a name without context, go quiet for a moment in the way veterans go quiet when something crosses their mind that they have spent years learning to redirect. But he never sat her down and said, "This is what happened, this is what I saw, this is what I brought home with me." He did that only once and only at the very end. What he gave her in those 2 years was muscle memory. The kind that does not live in your conscious mind, but somewhere deeper below thought in the part of your body that acts before your brain catches up. He gave her hands that knew what to do with a rifle the way a musician's hands know a piece of music in the dark. It was the most serious thing Glenn Carter ever did, and he did not do it lightly. He died in the spring of 2012. Sloan was 14. Her mother, Ruth Carter, held together with the quiet strength that nobody ever makes stories about. She planned the funeral, handled the paperwork, kept the house running, went back to work at the school where she had taught 3rd grade for 16 years. And on the night after the burial, when the last relatives had gone home and the house was finally still, she sat with Sloan at the kitchen table and cried in a way Sloan had never seen before and would never see again. When she was done, she took Sloan's hands in hers. She said, promise me you will never touch a gun again." She did not say it with anger. She was not trying to erase Glenn Carter or what he had taught his daughter. She was a woman who had watched a good man disappear from the inside over 20 years, and she had made a private equation in her grief between the military and the loss and the gun, and she was asking her daughter to step outside of it, to choose something that led somewhere other than the same end. Sloan promised. She meant it. She joined the Navy at 18, not the combat track. She trained as a corpsman because she wanted to serve and had found another kind of precision in medicine. The same stillness her father had taught her applied to different instruments, sutures instead of scopes, pressure rather than triggers. She was exceptional at it from the start. She had the hands for it, her instructor said without knowing why. She served 4 years with a conventional unit before a recruiter from SOCOM contacted her with an offer that almost nobody received. The Special Operations Command Intelligence Support Pipeline was a new program designated as a support and analysis role, but involving enough field exposure that the line between analyst and operator blurred considerably. It was not supposed to put her in harm's way. She was one of 4 women selected for the first cohort, and she had scored in the top 3% of every assessment, and she said yes without hesitating. She had been in the program less than a year when they sent her to northern Romania. But that story belongs to the second part of what happened to Sloan Carter. What matters now is the morning she arrived at FOB Redfern in eastern Idaho with a deployment bag on her shoulder and a titanium case that nobody in that facility knew she was carrying, assigned to replace the corpsman for a SEAL recon element that had been operating short-handed for 6 days. Captain Miles Hargrove met her at the vehicle gate, 48 years old, broad across the chest, with a face that had stopped being easy to read a long time ago. He had commanded his element for 3 years. He was thorough, capable, and fair, in the way some officers are fair, not because they are soft, but because they understand that fairness is a tactical asset over the long run. He looked at Sloan the way he looked at every new addition to his team, not dismissively, without warmth. He needed a corpsman. He had a corpsman. Evaluation would happen in the field where it was supposed to happen. He did, when she was out of earshot, pull her file and read it end to end. Corpsman strong reviews from 2 previous postings, SOCOM pipeline selection assessment scores that were genuinely unusual, and then about 2/3 through a medical separation from a classified mission in Romania. Listed cause motor vehicle accident during field training exercise. The file closed there. No investigation documented. No follow-up report. No clarifying paperwork of any kind. Hargrove had seen enough military files in his career to know that when a file closes that cleanly in the middle of something that should have generated substantial documentation, the absence is itself a form of information. He noted it. He kept it to himself. He decided to watch. Briggs was less measured. Derek Briggs was 35 years old and had been Special Operations Infantry long enough to have strong opinions about nearly everything, including the proper composition of a combat medical element. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had learned to trust certain patterns and was wary of deviation from them. He looked at Sloan, 5'4", 120 pounds carbon fiber prosthetic on her left leg, and performed the rapid assessment he performed on everyone. "Fantastic," he said to no one specifically. "They sent us a GIMP doc." Sloan heard it. She did not respond. She was looking at the medical kit laid out on the equipment room table, running a quiet inventory. She pulled out her own kit and began filling gaps without being asked. 3 items she added immediately: a second C, AT tourniquet, a package of combat gauze hemostatic dressing, and a decompression needle still in sterile packaging. She checked the needle gauge, set it down with the others. Briggs watched her do this from across the room. He did not say anything else. He did not stop watching either. Clifton Webb said nothing. Webb was the oldest member of the element outside Hargrove, a chief warrant officer at 52, with a background in long-range reconnaissance that went back further than some of the junior operators' entire lives. He was not a man who wasted words. He spoke when speech was necessary and was quiet the rest of the time, and in that quiet he observed things with the patient attention of someone who had learned that the most important information rarely announces itself. He had watched Sloan work through her kit inventory. He had noticed something specific about the tourniquet placement, not where standard protocol put it, but exactly where a left-handed draw under fire would reach it fastest. Someone had optimized that placement through repetition. Someone had rehearsed drawing a tourniquet under conditions where their hands might be shaking. Webb filed it and said nothing. The first field exercise was a daylight reconnaissance patrol 6 kilometers out and back, no contact expected. Sloan went out with the team. She kept pace without difficulty. The prosthetic was high performance, and she had been using it long enough that her adaptation to it was no longer immediately obvious. Briggs watched her anyway. He had a gift for noticing physical deviations. About 3 kilometers out, Cody Marsh began to slow. Marsh was 24, the youngest member of the team, a solid operator who had made a hydration error that morning, and the sun was higher than forecasted, and the combination was catching him before he caught it himself. He maintained pace through what was becoming real effort because nobody on the team wanted to be the man who called a halt and because early heat exhaustion is easy to push through until suddenly it is not. Sloan noticed when his reaction time lagged by half a second. Not dramatic, nobody else caught it. She was watching everyone the way corpsmen learned to watch, not for the obvious signs, but for the small deviations that precede the obvious signs by 10 or 15 minutes. She moved up alongside Marsh quietly. "How much did you drink this morning?" she said. He told her. She did the math. He was short by 40% of what the temperature required. She had him stopped in 90 seconds, not dramatically. She called a water break in a tone that made it sound routine, moved Marsh to a shaded position by the tree line, and ran a quiet assessment and rehydration protocol that was invisible to anyone watching who did not know what they were looking at. Briggs watched. "Lucky catch," he said when they resumed. Webb said nothing. He helped with the water and then fell into pace beside Sloan at the rear of the formation. After 300 meters, he said without preamble, "The tourniquet in your kit, left cargo pocket pulled angle. That is not standard issue placement." Sloan looked at him. "More accessible for my draw." "Your left-handed draw," he said, "under pressure. Someone taught you to draw a tourniquet under conditions where your hands might not be cooperating." He did not look at her while he said it, just watched the tree line the way he always watched tree lines. "What did your father do before he retired?" She held his gaze for a moment. "Why are you asking?" "Because it is a question I will keep asking until I get an answer," he said without particular edge, simply stating a fact. She did not answer him then. She did not walk away either. She held his look for one more beat and then went back to her position. Webb filed a response alongside everything else. That evening, in the natural settling that happens when a group of people share close quarters under low-level stress, the team occupied the equipment room in various states of post-patrol unwinding. Briggs told a story. He often told stories. This one was about a corpsman from a previous deployment, another unit who had made a field assessment error with permanent consequences for the man he was treating. Briggs was not aiming it at Sloan. He was processing his own history with medics who had overreached, which was a specific and real history. But Hargrove heard it the way he heard everything Briggs said, with the awareness that stories do not entirely separate from the teller's present concerns. Hargrove also noticed something else. During this same period, Sloan had picked up Webb's M24 from the equipment table, tilting it to glass the distant tree line through the observation window, a common enough action for anyone with a few minutes in a good optic. What happened in the next 2 seconds was not common. She rotated the elevation turret by 3 clicks and adjusted the parallax setting without looking at the markings. She settled the rifle against her shoulder with a natural stock weld that did not look like someone handling an unfamiliar piece of equipment. Her right eye relaxed behind the scope. Her breathing slowed visibly, the controlled deceleration that has nothing to do with calm and everything to do with deep practice. Her trigger finger curved slightly and came to rest against an imaginary trigger guard in the exact position of a shooter preparing to break a shot. It lasted 2 seconds. Then she put the rifle down and went back to her kit. She did not look around to see if anyone had noticed. Webb had watched from across the table. He stood very still for a moment after she put the rifle down, the way a man stands still when something has rearranged something else in his understanding. Then he went back to his maintenance check without comment. Hargrove had been standing in the doorway. He had seen all of it. He turned and walked back toward the operations room without saying anything. But the file on Sloan Carter, the one that closed too cleanly in the middle of Romania, had moved to a different part of his mind. That night after the briefing, after the base had settled into the particular quiet of a facility that is never fully quiet, Sloan sat on the edge of her bunk and opened the small, hard-sided case she kept at the bottom of her deployment bag. Inside was a photograph. Glenn Carter stood in the center of the frame. He was thinner than Sloan remembered from her childhood. Desert Storm had been 3 years before she was born, and the man in the photograph was a younger version of her father, less worn, still carrying what the years would gradually subtract. He was in desert utilities, no cover, squinting slightly against the Kuwait sun. Around him stood 7 other men in similar dress, various heights and builds, all of them carrying the loose ease of people who were between difficult things and did not yet know what was coming next. 8 men who were alive and had a few minutes to be ordinary. On the back of the photograph, in her father's handwriting, truth weighs more than silence. But you carry it when the time is right. She had been carrying it for 12 years. She put the photograph back, closed the case, lay back on the bunk and looked at the ceiling. The radio on the desk crackled twice. She sat up. Not because radio traffic was unusual, because of the frequency. She knew frequencies the way musicians know pitch. The transmission was coming in on a CIA tactical coordination band, the kind used by Special Activities Group elements. A SEAL recon team had no operational reason to be receiving it, and certainly no authorization to have access to it. She sat still and listened to the full transmission. 32 words, a grid reference, an estimated time of arrival, and a phrase that people who work in that world use when the objective of an operation is not capture or recovery, but the kind of outcome that leaves no documentation behind. She stood up. She pulled her kit from under the bunk and began to move with the quiet efficiency of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen, and now that it has happened, is simply executing the plan that was already in place. She had known something like this was coming since Romania. Since the morning she woke up in a German military hospital with her leg gone and a young army officer sitting beside her bed with a prepared statement about motor vehicle accidents. She had spent 3 years getting ready for tonight. The titanium case had been in the lining of her deployment bag since she arrived at Redfern. Before that, a storage unit in Nashville that only she knew existed. Before that, in the ground beneath a red oak tree on her father's property in Tennessee, exactly where Glenn Carter had told her it would be in the last quiet hours before the hospital took him for the final time and he did not come back. She put the case under her arm. She put the Remington in its soft case over her shoulder. She had studied the facility map for 3 days before arriving with particular attention to structures that were not on the official base diagram. The bunker. Depression-era concrete construction, 12 feet below grade, 3 reinforced walls, 1 entrance. Signal blocking capacity from the rebar density in the poured concrete overhead. She moved through the space in the dark with the certainty that belongs to preparation rather than courage. 15 minutes later, she was underground. She detached her prosthetic because she had found over years of navigating environments with 1 biological leg and 1 carbon fiber, one that there are situations where 2 points of contact with the ground give more stability than 3. She set it beside her. She put the rifle across her lap. She set the case in front of her. She checked the time on the satellite device. The upload had been running for 4 hours and 22 minutes, 94 minutes remaining on the scheduled delivery. She reached over and triggered the northeast perimeter sensor manually. Then she sat down and waited for whoever was going to come. 49 minutes later, 6 men came down the stairs. The contact came 12 minutes into the second patrol, not from the direction anyone expected. The threat assessment had put the primary axis of approach from the south. What hit them came from the east from a ridgeline that the morning reconnaissance had cleared and that should have still been clear. It was not. Someone had moved into position during the window between the first patrol's return and the second's departure, which meant either the intelligence was wrong or the intelligence had been given to the wrong people. And in Sloan's experience, those 2 possibilities carried very different implications. The first round clipped the rock face to Hargrove's left. The second round found Cody Marsh. It caught him in the upper right thigh and he went down hard. The sound he made was not a scream. It was a short, compressed exhale, the kind a body makes when pain arrives before the brain has decided what to do about it. He hit the ground and immediately tried to get back up, which was the training overriding everything else, and Briggs was on him in 2 seconds, pulling him behind the low rock formation along the western edge of the trail. Sloan was already moving. She moved fast and low, using the same rock formation, keeping her profile below the ridgeline sightline, and she arrived at Marsh's position and got her hands on him before he had fully processed what had happened. The entry wound was high on the thigh medial aspect, and that location meant one thing above all others. She had approximately 90 seconds to determine whether the femoral artery had been compromised before the question became academic. She cut his pants leg with the trauma shears from her left cargo pocket, not the kit because the kit took 2 seconds longer to access and she did not have 2 seconds. She had run this assessment before. Her hands moved without deliberation, pressing and reading, feeling for pulse quality in the distal vessels, watching the bleed rate, and the color, making 3 separate determinations in the span of about 4 heartbeats. The artery was intact. Badly compromised and likely to cause secondary problems within the hour, but intact. The bleed was serious and manageable with immediate intervention. She had a cat tourniquet around his thigh and locked down in 41 seconds. Marsh looked at her. He was pale in the way people go pale when their body is redirecting resources. "Talk to me," she said. "I'm good," he said. "You're going to stay good," she said. "Hands flat on the ground. Don't move the leg." She looked up. The fire from the ridgeline had pinned the team in 3 separate positions. Briggs was behind the rock with Marsh and Sloan weapon up, but without a viable angle on the shooter. Webb and two others had made it to a drainage cut 30 meters north, likewise pinned. Hargrove was the furthest forward and had the worst of it flat against the boulder that was barely sufficient for the purpose Colvage position reports over the radio with the calm of a man managing a situation rather than being overwhelmed by one. The shooter on the ridgeline was good. Controlled rate of fire patient between shots using the elevation the way it was meant to be used. Range was somewhere between 7 and 800 meters based on time of flight. The angle meant Webb's position in the drainage cut had no shot. Briggs had no shot. Hargrove had the worst view. Webb's M24 was on the ground in the drainage cut. She could see it from here. She could see Webb looking at it and understanding that he could not use it from his position without standing, and standing was not currently survivable. Hargrove's voice came over the radio. "We need that shot. Now." Briggs looked around the rock. No angle. He knew before he looked. He pulled back. Sloan looked at Marsh. His color was holding. The tourniquet was seated correctly. He was conscious. As stable as she could make him in the next 3 minutes without moving him, which she could not do until the ridgeline was cleared. She looked at Webb's rifle. The rock formation they were behind gave a narrow shooting lane if she moved 12 feet north along its base and shot prone. Not ideal. Nothing about it was ideal, but it was a lane. 90 seconds with Marsh, she said. Then give me that rifle. Briggs started to say something. She was already moving. She reached the M24 in a low crawl that stayed below the rock's natural parapet and covered the distance faster than the geometry of the situation should have allowed. She picked up the rifle and felt its weight settle into her hands with a familiarity that had nothing to do with the last 3 years and everything to do with the 12 years before that. She made 2 adjustments to the turrets from feel, not from reading the markings. Her fingers knowing the increments, the way her father had taught them to know the increments on Saturday mornings in Tennessee when she was 12 years old, and the world was still a place where the worst possible outcome was a missed paper target. She settled into the prone. Her left elbow found the ground. Her cheek found the stock. She breathed. 4 seconds in. Hold. 8 out. The scope picture resolved. 780 meters. She found the position, a shallow depression behind a granite outcropping, the natural height a competent shooter would select, and that a careful shooter would have improved with minimal effort. She could see the muzzle. She could see enough. Wind from the northwest. 8 to 10 knots at her position, probably 12 at the ridge. She adjusted right. She squeezed the trigger. The round went left. Not by much. Enough. The shooter on the ridge moved, which told her the shot had registered as a near miss, and that the position had not yet changed enough to require a full reacquisition. She worked the bolt without hurrying. Hurry was the enemy of the next shot the way it was the enemy of every shot, and her father had spent 2 years making sure she understood that hurry was a temptation you felt and a decision you declined. She adjusted her windage by a quarter turn. Found the position again in the glass. The shooter had dropped lower behind the outcropping, which actually improved her angle slightly. She breathed. She squeezed. 780 meters. The recoil moved through her and she came back to the glass. The position on the ridgeline was still. She kept the scope on it for 4 seconds. No movement. No muzzle adjustment. Nothing. She put the rifle down and turned back to Marsh in the same low movement she had used to reach it. She checked the tourniquet. Checked his pulse. Checked his color. Took his blood pressure with the cuff from her main kit and wrote the number and the time on his forearm with the surgical marker clipped inside her left sleeve. "How is the pain?" she said. "There," he said. "Keep your hands flat," she said. She was aware in the way you become aware of things when your focus is correctly directed elsewhere that nobody around her was speaking. The team had begun to reassemble as the ridgeline threat was removed, and they had come back to the main position, and they were standing in the loose, uncertain arrangement of people who have witnessed something that does not yet have a category in their existing understanding. Briggs was standing 6 feet away looking at her. She did not look back. She finished her assessment of Marsh and began preparing him for movement because the tourniquet had a clock on it and the clock was already running. Hargrove came up beside her. He stood for a moment before he spoke. "Where did you learn that?" he said. She did not stop working. "My father taught me," she said. He waited. She did not add anything. He looked at the rifle. He looked at the ridgeline. He stored the question for when it could receive the answer it deserved. Briggs said nothing. This was a different silence from anything Sloan had heard from him in the previous 24 hours. Not the silence of a man caught short, the silence of a man running a private recalculation, going back through what he had assumed and checking it against what he had just watched finding that the arithmetic no longer produced the same sum. Webb came out of the drainage cut and helped carry Marsh back to the FOB without being asked, taking the left side while Briggs took the right. Somewhere during that walk, he said quietly to no one in particular, just stated aloud as if he had been thinking it for some time, both hands. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. That evening, while Marsh was being assessed by the base medical officer and the rest of the team was in debrief, Webb used the weight of 22 years of operational relationships to access a system he was not officially authorized to access. He pulled Sloan Carter's full service record. Everything up to the summer of 2021 was present. Navy Corpsman, 2 deployments, exceptional reviews. SOCOM pipeline selection training records assessment scores that Webb spent a moment with because they were genuinely unusual. Then the gap. A single line medical separation, honorable reason classified. And then nothing. No mission reports from the Romania deployment period. No after-action reviews. No incident documentation. In the space where the paperwork for a serious field injury would normally generate between 40 and 80 separate documents, there was one line and a classification stamp and a door that had been deliberately closed. He found Sloan in the equipment room running her end-of-day kit check. He sat down across from her. Romania, he said, 2021, IED. Who said it? She looked at him steadily. She had been expecting this question or something close to it from someone. The fact that it was Webb asking made it easier. What did the file tell you, she said. Motor vehicle accident, he said. Field training exercise. She nodded slowly. That is what the file says. I know what the file says, he said. I am asking what happened. She was quiet for a moment, not deciding whether to speak, deciding where to begin, how to hand someone else the first piece of something large and heavy that had been hers alone for a long time. My father, she said. You need to start there. Glenn Carter had been 26 years old when he deployed to the Gulf. Delta Force attached to a composite special operations task force staging out of eastern Saudi Arabia. 8 years and fully developed as an operator in the way the Army builds people over a decade of focused work. He was good at his job in the comprehensive way that Delta Force operators are good at theirs. The mission happened in late January of 1991, in the final weeks of the air campaign before the ground war began. 8 men, Glenn Carter among them, were inserted into southern Iraq to conduct time-sensitive reconnaissance of a facility flagged as a potential chemical weapons storage point. The mission was black. It did not appear on any official operational log. The 8 men who went in were operating in the space where the institutional protection of the military does not follow. They found the facility. They found it was not primarily a chemical weapons site. What they found instead, in a structure adjacent to the main compound, was a meeting in progress. 3 American civilians, and Glenn Carter would later confirm they were genuine civilians based on documentation he recovered, were sitting across a table from 2 Iraqi officials. On the table were documents, a portable hard drive, and a substantial amount of U.S. currency. The nature of the discussion was not difficult to determine from what was visible, and the conversation fragments the team was close enough to overhear. Oil concessions, post-war development rights, southern Iraqi fields that would become accessible once the conflict ended. An arrangement being structured before the conflict had concluded by American private interests operating with the evident knowledge and assistance of certain American officials whose authorization of the meeting implied something considerably worse than opportunism. Glenn's team reported it back on the emergency channel and waited for instruction. 6 hours later, their position was compromised. The attack came from a direction and with a level of coordination that required advanced knowledge of where they were. 7 men died. Glenn Carter survived because of a circumstance of terrain that placed him in a position the attacking force could not effectively cover, and because he had the physical capability and the will to remain still for 9 hours until a rescue element reached him. He came out of Iraq carrying one thing he had not gone in with, a hard case he had taken from the facility during the chaos of the attack, a case that had been in the possession of the American civilians and that contained the documentation of everything that had been discussed at that table. He came home. He was debriefed. He told his story to the people he was supposed to tell it to and watched it go up the chain and not come back down. No investigation was initiated. No action was taken against the individuals whose names appeared in the documentation. The 7 men who died were given proper military burials, and their deaths were attributed to enemy action in an active theater of conflict, which was technically accurate in the same way that saying a house burned is technically accurate without explaining who set the fire. Glenn kept the case. Not out of any immediate plan, but out of a conviction that hardened over years. The case was the only evidence that could not be made to disappear as long as he had it. CIA had the copies of everything else. CIA could manage the institutional record. What CIA could not manage was the physical case which had been in Glenn's possession since the night of the attack and which he had never disclosed in any subsequent debrief. He kept it for 21 years. And when his lungs told him, with the unmistakable clarity of a serious illness, what the timeline looked like, he began to prepare his daughter for what she would inherit. Sloan told Webb most of this. She omitted the specific names in the case because those names were the load-bearing structure of everything that followed, and she was not ready to place them on a table in a military facility where she could not account for who was listening. But she gave him enough that the shape of it was clear. Romania, she said, was because I was the last living person who knew the case existed and knew where it was. When I finished the SOCOM pipeline and began getting real field exposure, someone made the assessment that the simplest solution was to remove the only person who could connect the case to the people it implicated. CIASAD, he said. She held his gaze and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. And the case, he said, where is it now? She looked at him for a long moment. Close, she said. He did not push it. He had enough. He sat back and looked at her with the expression of a man who has reassigned someone from one category to another in his understanding of the world and who finds the new category considerably more serious than the previous one. Who else knows you are here, he said. One person, she said. Someone my father trusted. Someone who has been waiting a long time to see this finished. The next morning, the situation escalated. The contact on the ridgeline had not been opportunistic. It had been a ranging probe, an attempt to assess the team's defensive disposition before a more significant action. Hargrove had understood this during the debrief and restructured the patrol plan accordingly, pushing observation posts further out and adding a monitoring layer on the frequencies that had seemed anomalous 2 nights earlier. At 0340 hours, what came through on those frequencies confirmed what Sloan had already known was coming. A CIA, Special Activities Group advance element, was moving into the operational area with a specific targeting package. The language was operational and coded, but the meaning was not ambiguous to anyone who had worked in proximity to that kind of mission. The team was in the field when the second contact came. Pre-dawn, 2 kilometers east of the FOB, clearing the ridge approach from the previous day. Not a sniper this time. 3 coordinated positions designed to divide and pursue. The team was split. Briggs and 2 others were pushed north by fire from the eastern position. Webb and 1 other made a covered position to the south. Hargrove was with Sloan and Marsh had taken a second wound to graze across the left shoulder, less serious than the thigh, but bleeding actively and compromising his movement. The CIA element's advanced shooter was on the north slope. Sloan assessed the range at 1,150 meters from the sound signature and the muzzle flash. The light was low with a wind out of the northwest that had strengthened overnight and was running 12 to 14 knots at ground level, which meant higher and more variable at the shooter's elevation. Hargrove was carrying Webb's M24. He had taken it from the equipment rack before the patrol based on what the morning's intelligence suggested they were walking into. He looked at Sloan. She had one hand on Marsh's shoulder wound, applying direct pressure with a hemostatic dressing, monitoring the saturation rate, running the clock on how long before the dressing needed reinforcement. Hargrove held the rifle out to her. She looked at it. She looked at the north slope. She looked at Marsh. 20 seconds, she said. She reinforced the dressing with a secondary layer, took Marsh's hand and placed it over the pressure point. Hold exactly this pressure. Do not adjust it. Marsh nodded. She took the rifle. 15 meters to the right, a natural V between 2 rock formations gave her a stable platform and enough concealment that the muzzle signature would be partially obscured. She got there in 9 seconds. She set up prone. 1,150 meters. 14-knot crosswind gusting unpredictably. She was lying on her right side because the geometry of the V required it not an optimal position for a right-handed shooter, and the rock fragment that had caught her shoulder during the movement to this position was making the natural point of aim something she would need to override. She did not let it matter. She breathed. She found the position in the glass. She made her calculations. Elevation, wind drift at range, the gusting variable that required timing as much as calculation. The gusts were cycling at approximately 80 seconds. The window between gusts was 3 seconds. She needed one. She waited for the cycle to pass. It passed. She squeezed. 1,150 meters. 1 round. The north slope stopped generating fire. She worked the bolt, kept the glass on the position for 3 seconds. Nothing moved. She put the rifle down and was back at Marsh's side in 11 seconds, checking the dressing, checking his pulse, checking the color of his lips and nail beds. You did exactly right, she said. He looked at her. He was pale and tired and 24 years old and had been shot twice in 2 days, and he said, "Are you okay?" She looked at him for a moment. "I am fine," she said. She meant it. Hargrove stood nearby holding the rifle, watching her with the expression of a man who has revised a significant assumption and is still processing the full implications of the revision. Webb materialized from the southern position. He looked at Sloan, looked at the north slope, looked at Marsh. He said very quietly, the way someone states something they have been thinking for a long time and have simply decided to say aloud, "Both hands." Briggs came in from the north. He came to a stop a few feet from Sloan and looked at her with an expression that was working through several things at once, and what he said was not what anyone who knew Derek Briggs would have predicted. 1,150 meters, he said, gusting crosswind, non-dominant side position. Not a question, not a compliment. The coordinates of something real spoken aloud because naming it was the first step toward understanding it. Sloan was wrapping a fresh dressing on Marsh's shoulder. She did not look up. "We need to move him," she said. "The tourniquet on the thigh has 40 minutes before we need to convert. I need a stable surface and better light." 2 minutes, Hargrove said. They moved. Sloan brought Marsh back to the FOB alongside the team, one hand on the tourniquet for the entire walk, counting his pulse against her watch. At the FOB, she converted the tourniquet, packed the wound properly, took his blood pressure twice and wrote both numbers on his forearm. She positioned him against the eastern wall of the equipment room, with his leg elevated and his hands flat with instructions about what he was and was not to do for the next 4 hours. He said he understood. She believed him. She stayed through the debrief. When it concluded, she went to her quarters. She came out 12 minutes later with her deployment bag over one shoulder and the titanium case under her arm. She moved through the base at a pace that was unhurried and deliberate, the pace of someone going somewhere they have already decided to go. She went to the bunker. 11 minutes from the eastern gate to the entrance, exactly as she had pre-walked it twice in the dark the previous nights to confirm the timing. She went down the stairs. She set up the way she had planned. Checked the upload status on the satellite device, 4 hours and 22 minutes running. 94 minutes remaining on the scheduled delivery. She triggered the northeast perimeter sensor on her way in. Then she sat down, put the rifle across her lap, set the case in front of her, detached her prosthetic, and waited. The CIA element arrived 37 minutes ahead of the timeline she had calculated. She had built her estimate on the assumption that they would come overland from the northern staging area, which was the logical approach given the access roads and the elevation profile of the surrounding terrain. They did not come overland. They came by air, 2 helicopters running dark and low along the river valley to the west, and they were on the ground and moving before the sound of the rotors had fully resolved into something identifiable. It was a good approach. It suggested that whoever planned it had thought carefully about what a well-prepared person with knowledge of the facility would anticipate and had chosen specifically against it. Sloan heard the helicopters while the SEAL element was still in the room. Radio on Hargrove's vest crackled with the approach notification from the perimeter sensors, and everyone understood simultaneously that the situation had acquired a new variable. Cody Marsh was in the eastern corner, back against the wall, right leg elevated on a rolled sleeping mat that Webb had produced. His color was better than it had been on the slope. He was stable. He was not mobile. Hargrove looked at the radio. He looked at Sloan. "How many?" he said. 8 SAG personnel, she said, plus 1 senior officer traveling with the element. He does not usually come to these. Hargrove's expression shifted. "How do you know that?" "I have been monitoring their operational frequency since I arrived at your FOB 2 days ago," she said. "The same frequency your team has been receiving on a passive scanner since yesterday morning. I believed it was the former rather than the latter, meaning no one recognized it rather than someone recognizing it and choosing not to act. I believed that correctly, I think." Hargrove looked at Webb. Webb's expression confirmed nothing and denied nothing. Then Nathan Reeve moved. He had been standing at the back of the formation since the team entered the bunker, standard positioning for a medic in a breach scenario, quiet in the way Sloan had noted from the first moment and had assigned to professional restraint. He took 2 steps forward, moving around the left side of the formation toward Marsh, because Marsh was the wounded team member, and moving toward him was the most natural and defensible action a medic could take. He got close enough to see Sloan in the full light of the floor lamps. He stopped. Not the stop of someone reaching their destination. The stop of someone whose body has made a decision before the conscious mind caught up, the complete arrest of forward motion that happens when recognition arrives at a level below thought and overrides the instructions thought had issued. His right foot was mid-step and it came down wrong, slightly off angle, the way a body stops when the command arrives faster than the mechanics of the step can accommodate. He stood there with his weight incorrectly distributed, and he looked at Sloane Carter, and he did not look at the rifle, or the case, or anything else in the room that should have demanded attention. He looked at her face. Sloane looked back at him. She had known since the morning Briggs called her a gimp doc, and she had watched Reeve in the equipment room, noting the way he never stood where he could be seen clearly from her direction, the specific quality of his avoidance. She had spent 18 months reconstructing the identifier profile of the person who had confirmed her location on Route 7 from a partially accessible file. Rank, unit attachment, operational timeline. She had not been certain. Looking at his face now, she was certain. The freezing told her what the file had left incomplete. "You were in Bucharest," she said. "September 2021. A hotel room. A man in civilian clothes showed you a photograph." The room did not breathe. "I was told it was a surveillance confirmation," Reeves said. His voice was the voice of a man producing words through significant internal resistance. "Target location for a monitoring operation. You confirmed a human target for a lethal action," she said. The surveillance cover was given to the confirmation asset, so the asset could not later testify to direct knowledge of intent. "It is a standard compartmentalization technique for exactly this kind of operation." She paused. "You were given a story that was technically not a lie, but was entirely not the truth." He looked at her leg, at the carbon fiber prosthetic lying on the floor beside her. He had done this on the stairs, she now understood. He had seen it then in the first moment the floor lamps lit her, and the thing he had confirmed in that hotel room, without knowing what he was confirming, had landed on him with its full weight. "I did not know what they were going to do," he said. "You did not ask," she said. Not an accusation. A fact stated at the same temperature as every other fact in the room. "The river runs north. The mountain stands at this elevation." "You did not ask." Reeves stood very still for a long moment. Then he walked to the eastern wall and sat down against it 3 feet from Marsh and put his face in his hands. Not crying, processing. The interior collapse of a person who has just had the full weight of a thing they only partially understood come to rest on them completely. Hargrove watched him. Then he looked at Sloane. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has served long enough to know that the line between culpable and deceived is one of the most consequential lines in the moral geography of military service, and that it is almost never as clear as either side needs it to be. Sloane looked at Reeve for a moment. Then she looked away. She had not said what she said to destroy him. She had said it because it was true, and because truth in this room tonight was the only currency that still had value. At the stairwell, 2 figures appeared. Warren Holt was 64 years old and had not been in an active operational environment in 11 years. He had a Sig Sauer P226 in a shoulder holster under his jacket and a Beretta in the bag, carried by the man beside him, Marcus Decker, 67, who had once been gunnery sergeant with Force Recon and who had received a phone call 3 hours earlier asking nothing more than a grid reference and the question of whether he was available. Both men were available. Holt came into the room and looked at it with the comprehensive calm of someone who had arrived at the place he was supposed to be and was simply present in the way that matters. He looked at Marsh in the corner, looked at Reeve against the wall, looked at the titanium case in front of Sloane, and then he looked at Sloane. He had last seen her when she was 3 years old. He had watched her from a careful distance for 23 years after that, not intrusively, not in ways she was meant to detect, but from the outer perimeter of her life, checking distances and approaches and threats because Glenn Carter had asked him to. They had been deployed together in 1991 Holt at the forward staging area in Kuwait when the rescue element brought Glenn back out of Iraq 9 hours in the desert among his dead. Holt had been one of the first people Glenn spoke to. He had seen what Glenn was carrying, and he had understood what it meant, and he had not said a word to anyone for 3 decades because Glenn Carter had asked him not to. Glenn had given him the photograph and the letter at Fort Bragg in 1993. He had talked about the daughter who did not yet exist, and then about the daughter when she was born, and then about the daughter on Saturday mornings in the backyard of a Tennessee house. He had said, in the way men who are not prone to sentiment say the things they actually mean, "If something happens to me before this is finished, find her. Keep her safe until she can finish it herself." Glenn Carter died in 2012. Warren Holt had been at the perimeter of Sloane Carter's life ever since. She looked at him now from the floor of the bunker. "Holt," she said. "Carter," he said. It was everything that needed to be said between them at that moment, and both of them knew it. Hargrove looked at Holt with the recognition of a man identifying someone from an old file. You have been planning this for some time, he said to Sloan. My father planned it, she said. I finished it. Deputy Director Alan Cross came down the stairs last. He was 61 years old and had the bearing of a man for whom authority had become indistinguishable from his physical presence over 4 decades of accumulating it. Silver-haired trim, wearing a field jacket over a collared shirt, he had 8 SAG personnel ahead of him. You do not bring 8 SAG personnel to a recovery operation unless the operation has a contingency that goes beyond recovery. He came into the room and read it in 4 seconds. His personnel spread to the perimeter. Hargrove's element positioned between them and Sloan. Holton, a decker near the stairwell. Men his age, men from a generation that understood the weight of what was in the titanium case in ways that would take younger people considerably longer to reconstruct. Marsh in the corner, 24 years old, shot twice in 2 days watching the room with the open attention of someone young who has been through something that aged him. Cross walked toward the center of the room. Miss Carter, he said. Director Cross, she said. He stopped 6 feet from her. He looked at the case. He had been looking for it since 2012, since Glenn Carter's death made it findable after 2 decades of irrecoverability. I will need that, he said. You are welcome to it, she said. It contains what it has always contained. The documentation of an unauthorized operation in January 1991 in which 3 American officials authorized the exposure of a Delta Force element's position for private financial consideration. 7 men died. The 8th lived long enough to take the case and carry it home. She looked at him directly. Your name is on page 52, CIA Deputy Director, 1991. Blue ink, Parker pen if I had to estimate. Cross said nothing for several seconds. He was not a man who reacted to accurate information. He processed it. He placed it in context. Your father was a careful man, he said. He was a correct man, she said. Careful was secondary. He held government property for 21 years. He held evidence of a crime. The legal distinction between those two things is not trivial. Cross looked around the room. He was running the calculation she had known he would run, the same calculation she had been working against for 3 years, the one that ended with a powerful man determining what could still be managed and what could not. The case does not have what you came for, she said. He stopped. Meaning what? She put her hand on the carbon fiber prosthetic lying beside her. She lifted it and held it for a moment the way a person holds something they have carried for a long time. 3 years ago, she said, when I left a German military hospital with one leg and a paper trail that ended with the words motor vehicle accident, I understood that they had made a mistake. They took my leg. They believed that was sufficient. They did not consider that a person who loses a limb and replaces it with a prosthetic ends up wearing a device with considerably more internal volume than most people would think to account for. She turned the prosthetic once in her hands. The first thing I did when I was cleared for weight bearing was have this device modified by a prosthetist in Nashville, a former Army Ranger who had known my father and who understood when I explained the situation without explaining the details that what I was asking him to do was the right thing to do. She set the prosthetic down. Every document in that case has been digitized and stored on an encrypted drive the size of a thumbnail embedded in the medial wall of the prosthetic for the past 2.5 years. I have walked through 14 security checkpoints with it. I have been searched twice by CIA support personnel specifically looking for electronic storage devices. I have carried the entire evidentiary record of what happened in Iraq in 1991, 6 inches from my body every single day since the first time I stood up and took a step. The room absorbed this. Briggs looked at the prosthetic on the floor. He looked at Sloan. He exhaled slowly through his nose, the exhale of a man who has encountered something that has moved the outer boundary of what he thought was possible. Webb said, almost below hearing, both hands. Well, what he meant was not only that she could heal and fight, he meant that she had been carrying the truth in the same body she used to do everything else. That the weapon and the medicine and the evidence had been in the same person the whole time, walking through the world on 2 feet, one of which contained everything necessary to end 33 years of silence. Cross looked at the prosthetic. He looked at Sloan. He looked at the room again. The upload, he said, completes in 41 minutes, she said. 7 recipients, 3 investigative journalists at major publications, 2 members of the Senate Armed Services Committee, 1 from each party, a former Department of Defense Inspector General currently writing a memoir located in a country outside your operational reach, and 1 additional recipient I have not disclosed and will not disclose. She paused. You can reach 2 of the 7, possibly 3. The others are beyond what you can do in 41 minutes. I can stop the server. You cannot stop the server, she said. I used a distributed system across 3 separate hosting environments. Stopping one does not stop the others. I had 3 years to plan this. I planned it well. Cross was quiet for a moment. He looked at the 8 personnel he had brought, and the 6 SEAL operators, and Holt and Decker at the stairwell, and Marsh in the corner, watching with the particular attention of someone young and wounded who is seeing how the people with authority handle serious things. You planned for all of it, he said. My father planned for most of it, she said. I planned for the parts he could not have anticipated, including you coming here personally, which I considered a lower probability outcome. Senior officers generally send people. I sent people 3 years ago, he said. I know, she said. That is why you came yourself this time. Cross stood in front of her and ran the full calculation. He ran it without self-deception because self-deception had never been one of his operating failures, and what the calculation produced this time was different from what it had produced on every previous occasion over the past 3 years when he had assessed Sloane Carter as a manageable problem. She was not a manageable problem. She had not been a manageable problem since the day she left the hospital in Germany and decided what she was going to do with the time she had. What do you want, he said. 8 names are read aloud in a Senate hearing room, she said, on the record, with the documentation entered as evidence in a setting where it cannot be reclassified after the fact. I want the families of 7 men who were told their fathers and sons and husbands died in enemy action to know what actually happened to them. I want it in the permanent public record where it remains regardless of who holds which office in 10 years or 20. She looked at him steadily. That is all I want. I am not interested in the destruction of this institution. I am interested in the truth having a permanent address. Cross was quiet for a long time. He looked at the titanium case that Glenn Carter had carried out of Iraq in his hands and kept in the ground for 21 years and entrusted to his daughter to finish. He looked at the woman who had carried what the case contained inside her own prosthetic leg for 2.5 years, through checkpoints and searches and the ordinary movements of a life rebuilt around a single patient purpose. He made the gesture to his personnel, small and economical and requiring no verbal instruction. They stood down from the perimeter geometry, not a formal concession, not an acknowledged defeat, but the recognition that the room's arithmetic no longer supported the operation as originally planned, and that a man who had survived 4 decades in intelligence had done so partly by knowing when the numbers had changed irrevocably. Through proper channels, he said, legal representation, Senate committee. Agreed, she said. He looked at her one more time. Something crossed his face briefly that might have been a different version of respect from the one he was accustomed to offering people, or might have been the private acknowledgement of a man who has come to the end of a very long thing and finds the ending different from every version he had anticipated. He turned and went up the stairs. His 8 personnel followed. The sound of their boots on the concrete overhead faded until the bunker was quiet again. The room held its silence for several seconds. Then Briggs exhaled a long, controlled breath that he had apparently been managing for some time. He pushed off the wall and walked across the room to where Sloane was sitting. He stopped in front of her. He looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment. He put out his hand. She took it. He pulled her to her feet. She reached down for the prosthetic and attached it in 3 practice movements and stood on both feet and looked at him from a distance that was no longer the floor and the ceiling. He said, "Where did your father learn to shoot?" She almost smiled. The approach of it was there close enough to be visible. "Tennessee," she said. "Same place he taught me." Hargrove came forward with the deliberate walk of a man who has decided what he is going to say. He stood in front of Sloane and said, "I will put a formal recommendation to command, integrated combat role designation. You have demonstrated the qualification more than once tonight and before tonight." Sloane looked at him. "I appreciate that, sir. With respect, a designation is not what I need from command. What I need is for 8 names to be read aloud in a Senate hearing room on the record with documentation entered as evidence. That is the outcome that matters. That is what my father spent 21 years preserving the possibility of." Hargrove held her gaze. He nodded. "I will make both recommendations," he said. Webb was near the stairwell. He had not spoken during any of the preceding exchanges. He had simply been present in the way he was always present, thoroughly and without waste. He looked at Sloane with the expression he had worn since the second patrol, the expression of a man who had done his recalculation early and had been waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. He said both hands. It was the 4th time he had said it over the course of these 2 days. It accumulated meaning each time the way a right phrase accumulates meaning when it is the correct phrase for the thing it is describing. Sloane looked at him. "Both hands," she said. Holt came and settled against the wall to her left without ceremony. He did not speak for several minutes. Then he said, "He would have been proud of you." She looked at the case in front of her. "He told me the truth weighs more than silence," she said. "He told me to carry it when the time was right." "Was the time right?" Holt said. She was quiet for a moment. "It was the only time there was going to be," she said. Holt nodded. He leaned his head back against the concrete wall and was asleep in 3 minutes, the sleep of a man who has been awake for 20 hours and has done what he came to do. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Sloane's satellite device registered a single notification. Scheduled delivery completed. 7 of 7 recipients confirmed. She read it twice. She put the device in her pocket. She did not announce it. She did not stand up and declare anything to the room. She simply sat for a moment in the concrete quiet of a bunker that smelled like cold concrete and old secrets, and she let 33 years of silence shift from one side of a scale to the other, and she understood that the shift was permanent and that permanent was the only kind that mattered. Outside, above 12 feet of reinforced concrete, the sun was coming up over the pine forest of eastern Idaho, doing what the sun does regardless of what has happened in the dark below it, which is to say arriving completely and indifferently, concerned with nothing except the fact of its own arrival. 6 months later at Fort Bragg, North Carolina on a Tuesday morning, in the kind of fall weather that carries the feeling of a beginning, Sloane Carter walked into a classroom and wrote 4 words on the board. "Drag them out alive." She set the marker down and turned to face 16 people in 4 rows. They were a range of ages and backgrounds. Men and women, some with deployment experience and some without, all of them looking at her with the attention of people who have been told they are in the right room. On her left foot was a new carbon fiber prosthetic, a better model issued through a VA program that had moved faster than VA programs typically move, and once 2 members of the Senate Armed Services Committee had taken a direct interest in the case of a Navy corpsman whose medical separation had been classified for reasons that were now part of an active congressional inquiry. The inquiry had been open for 4 months. The 8 names from the 1991 case had been entered into the Senate record in a closed hearing 6 weeks after the night in the bunker. They had not yet been made fully public. The process was slower than Sloane had hoped and faster than she had feared, which she had decided was the accurate measure of institutional accountability, slower than it should be, faster than nothing, and permanent once it arrived. In the front row first seat, Cody Marsh sat with both legs extended under the desk and a notepad open in front of him. He had been discharged from the hospital 2 months after the Idaho operation. His first formal request after discharge had been for assignment to the inaugural cohort of the Integrated Combat Medicine Program. The request had been approved without deliberation. 3 rows back, last seat on the right, sat a man named Nathan Reeve, who had requested enrollment through a channel that required a commanding officer's recommendation and a personal statement. The personal statement had been 2 sentences. The CO's recommendation had been 1 paragraph. Sloane had read both documents and approved the enrollment without comment. She had not discussed it with anyone because she did not believe it required discussion. A person who wanted to spend 16 weeks learning to do the job correctly was a person she could work with. What he did with that afterward was between him and whatever he was in the process of settling with himself, and that process was his, not hers. Briggs had submitted a request to serve as a supplementary instructor for the program's tactical components. Nobody was surprised by the request except apparently Briggs himself. Sloane looked at the class. She looked at the 4 words on the board. "Everything we cover in the next 16 weeks comes back to those words," she said. "Not the distance of the shot, not the record of the engagement, not the story someone tells about you afterward in a room where you are not present to correct the details. The person on the ground who is still breathing when you walk off that field. That person is the mission. Every tool you carry, every skill you develop, every decision you make under conditions designed to make good decisions impossible, it all exists in service of that one outcome." She paused. "You will learn to use both tools. You will learn to use them to the same standard. You will learn to move between them without breaking the thread of what you are actually doing, which is keeping people alive. That thread is the mission. The thread is always the mission." She walked to the first desk and began distributing course packets. When she reached Marsh's desk, she set his down and he picked it up and looked at the cover and then looked up at her. He said, "Thank you." She looked at him. "Learn it well enough that someone else does not have to thank you someday," she said. "That is the only version of thank you that compounds." She continued down the row. That evening, after the classroom had emptied and the Fort Bragg day had settled into its own rhythms, she sat at a small desk in her quarters with her phone in her hand, looking at a contact she had been calling more frequently over the past 6 months than in the 6 years before that. Her mother answered on the second ring. Ruth Carter's voice was the same as it had always been, warm and measured, the voice of a woman who had spent 30 years teaching children and had developed an economy of reassurance that was genuine rather than performed. She said hello, and she said Sloane's name, and in both of those syllables was the contained and complicated love of a mother who had spent 3 years not asking the questions she needed to ask because she had understood that the answers would arrive when they arrived and not before the time. They talked for a long time about the program and the students and what the VA had requested in terms of curriculum expansion to 4 states. About the inquiry and what the timeline looked like from the outside, which was deliberate and ongoing and aimed at the right destination. About Glenn Carter and the way they had learned to talk about him in the past months, not around the grief but through it, the way experienced people move through difficult terrain rather than spending energy trying to find a path around it. Ruth Carter said near the end of the call, "He told me once that you were the most patient person he had ever met. He said it was a kind of patience he did not know how to teach, that you were born with it." Sloane was quiet for a moment. "He taught me what to do with it," she said. Ruth was quiet for a moment too. Then she said, "He would be so proud of you." Sloane looked out the window at the Fort Bragg night. The lights of the base spread across the flat North Carolina ground, everything outside ordinary and ongoing and indifferent to the particular weight of the conversation happening in this particular room. Her jaw tightened once and then released. "I know," she said. After she hung up, she remained at the window for a while. 26 years old. One biological leg and one carbon fiber. One in hands that could place a tourniquet in 41 seconds or around at 1,150 meters in a crosswind. And she had her father's patience and her father's understanding that the truth does not expire and does not negotiate and requires nothing from you, except that you carry it until the moment is right and then set it down somewhere it cannot be moved. She had set it down. In Montana on the same evening, Warren Holt sat alone in his cabin with a mug of coffee he had stopped drinking an hour earlier. The fire had burned to a low orange presence in the grate. On the table in front of him was the photograph he had carried in his jacket since 1993. The photograph he had looked at perhaps once a year or 31 years, when he needed to remind himself of the shape of a promise. He looked at it now for the last time. Not because he was done honoring it. He had honored it completely, which is different. The promise had a beginning and a middle and an end, and the end had occurred 6 months ago in a bunker in Idaho, when a 26-year-old woman had waited in the dark with the patience her father said she was born with and had done the work that the moment required. He set the photograph down on the table. He looked at the fire. "Done," he said. "It is done, Glenn." The fire answered the way fires answer, which is to say it did not answer at all. It burned the way it had been burning since before Holt sat down and would continue burning after he went to bed, steady and indifferent to everything except the fact of itself. In the morning at 06:12, Sloane's phone registered a new message. The language was institutional and formatted and made no allowances for the history behind the request it contained. Report for mission briefing at 800 hours. Classified environment. Bring full kit. She read it once, set the phone down, looked at the window. The North Carolina morning was beginning in the way mornings begin, indifferent to everything except their own arrival, which is to say without hesitation and without asking permission and without any concern for what had come before. She stood up. She began to prepare her kit in the careful, methodical way she had prepared every kit for the past 8 years, checking each item in sequence, accounting for everything, placing the tourniquet in the left cargo pocket, where a left-handed draw under pressure would find it fastest. Her hands moved with the practiced fluency of someone who has done this enough times that the action has become its own kind of language, efficient and certain and unencumbered by doubt. 8 names would be read aloud in a Senate hearing room. She put the bag over her shoulder. She walked out into the morning.